In the autumn of 1913, in a small town in the Dakota Badlands, a traveling photographer named Everett H. Miller arrived with his equipment and his darkroom wagon. He had been commissioned by the local historical society to document the remaining homesteads, the railroad depot, the main street, and the faces of the town's oldest residents before time took them. What he did not expect to find, and what 3 decades of silence would eventually reveal, was a story that the town itself had worked very hard to forget. Miller photographed the buildings. He photographed the families. He photographed the children in their Sunday clothes. And then he asked the Historical Society if there was anything else they wanted documented. There was a pause, he said later. A long pause. And then the Society's president, a man named Elias Turner, told him that there was a place outside of town, an old property, long abandoned, where certain things had happened that were not in the record books, and that perhaps it would be best if Miller left it alone. Turner gave him a map. On it, he had marked the location of the property. And then, with a steadiness that Miller described as the calm of a man who had made peace with something terrible, Turner told him to burn the map when he was done and to never speak of the property to anyone. Miller, who had been a photographer for 27 years and had learned to recognize when a story was dangerous, did exactly as he was told. He photographed the old property from a distance. He photographed the house, the barn, the collapsed windmill. He did not go inside. He did not dig. He did not ask any more questions. Those photographs, developed and printed in his wagon on the outskirts of that Dakota town, were never shown to anyone. Miller kept them in a sealed portfolio that he carried with him for the rest of his life. He left them to his daughter with instructions that they not be opened until 50 years after his death. When his daughter finally opened that portfolio in 1978, she found not only the photographs, but a letter, handwritten, 9 pages long, in which her father described what he had seen and what he had been told. Before we continue with the story of that photographer, that town, and the secret that was buried for 65 years, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an investigation like this one. And drop a comment below telling us what state or city you're listening from. We read every single one. Knowing where you are in the world reminds us that stories like this one and stories of what people will hide to protect what they have are not bound by geography. They happen everywhere. The town itself was not unusual by the standards of the Northern Plains in 1913. It had been settled in the 1880s by homesteaders who had come west on the promise of land and the hope of a life that was theirs. It had grown through the 1890s as the railroad pushed through, and it had peaked in the first decade of the new century, when the population reached perhaps 800 souls. By 1913, the town was entering the slow decline that would define its subsequent history: the loss of the youngest, the consolidation of farms, the quiet contraction of a community that had simply come too late to the place where it had settled. The businesses along Main Street were of the kind you would expect in a plains town of that era. A general store, a hardware, a bank, a grain elevator, 2 churches, Methodist and Catholic, a barbershop, a hotel, a schoolhouse that also served as the meeting hall. The railroad depot was still active, though less than it had been. The farmers who came to town on Saturdays were the same families who had been coming for years, the names familiar across generations. The property outside of town that Miller photographed, the one Elias Turner had marked on the map, was an old homestead that had belonged to a man named Jacob Deming. Deming had arrived in the area in 1886 with a wife and 2 children. He had filed a claim, built a house, begun the work of turning the prairie into a farm. The family had done well enough by the standards of the region. They had built a proper house, not a soddy. They had a barn and a windmill and a fenced garden. They had, by all accounts, been ordinary people living an ordinary life. And then, sometime around 1897, Jacob Deming had simply stopped coming to town. He had stopped purchasing supplies. He had stopped appearing at the Methodist church on Sundays, where his wife had been a regular attendee. People noticed. They rode out to the property to check on the family. What they found was a house that appeared to be occupied but whose occupants were not receiving visitors. Jacob Deming, when he came to the door, was polite. He said they were fine. He said they had decided to keep to themselves for a while. He said the winter had been hard and they needed rest. The neighbors accepted this explanation, as neighbors in isolated communities often did. But something about it did not sit right with certain people. A man named Louis Kruger, who had farmed the section adjacent to the Deming property and who had known Jacob since the early years, said later that he had seen a different quality in Jacob's manner that day, a quality he described as the look of a man who has decided something and is not interested in being argued out of it. That look, Kruger said, had struck him as more alarming than any visible distress would have been. The Deming property sat on a section of ground that was not, in any particular way, exceptional. It had good enough soil for the area, a reliable well, and a location that was close enough to town to be convenient but far enough to offer a degree of privacy. The house was a two-story frame structure with a stone foundation and a porch that faced south. The barn was built in the standard style of the region, large enough for a team of horses and a few head of cattle. There was a root cellar, a chicken coop, and a small windmill that pumped water from the well into a wooden tank that stood on a platform behind the house. What was unusual about the property, what would eventually lead to the discovery of what the Demings had been hiding, was not the house or the barn or the well. It was what was beneath them. The foundation of the house was not merely a foundation. It was, as later investigators would establish, a structure of considerable thickness, built of fieldstone set in a lime mortar that was far more substantial than the region's usual construction. The barn, too, had a cellar, an unusual feature for a barn in the Dakota Territory, where cellars were typically reserved for houses and root cellars. And between the house and the barn, running beneath the yard, was a passage. The passage was not connected to either structure in any visible way from the surface. It had been dug and lined with stone and roofed with heavy timbers that had been covered with a layer of sod and earth. It was, in the terms of the region, a structure that should not have existed. A homesteader in the Dakota Territory in the 1880s did not build underground passages. A homesteader in the Dakota Territory in the 1880s did not construct a stone-lined tunnel connecting the foundation of his house to the cellar of his barn. A homesteader in the Dakota Territory in the 1880s did not do this because there was no reason for it. Unless there was a reason. Unless there was a reason that he could not say out loud. The people who would eventually find the passage, they came decades later, after the Demings were gone and the property had passed through several hands, said that the entrance to the passage was concealed so carefully that it took them nearly a day to find it. The entrance was in the root cellar, behind a section of shelving that appeared to be fixed to the wall but was in fact mounted on a pivoting frame. The passage itself ran roughly 40 feet from the house to the barn, sloping downward slightly in the direction of the barn. The walls were stone, as noted, and the floor was packed earth that had been made level. There were no tools, no lanterns, no remnants of whatever had been kept there. But there were marks. The marks had been scratched into the stone at regular intervals, similar to the marks that Elias Croft had found in the chamber beneath the Massachusetts church in 1878. They were not numbers. They were not letters. They were marks that had been made with a sharp tool, and they had been made to count something. For the years that the property had stood empty, the passage had been waiting. And the marks on the wall had been the only evidence of what it had been used for. Elias Turner, the Historical Society president who had given Miller the map and told him to burn it, was 87 years old in 1913. He had been born in the Dakota Territory before statehood, had grown up in the region, and had been a young man during the years when the Demings had lived on their property. He was, in the words of the few people who knew him, a man who did not forget. And he was, by the time he met Everett Miller, a man who had decided that the truth should be preserved not in the official record, where it could be found and used, but in the memory of someone who would carry it into the dark and take it with him. What Turner told Miller that afternoon, sitting in the back room of the Historical Society building, is recorded in the letter Miller's daughter would eventually find. Turner spoke for nearly 3 hours. He spoke about the Demings, Jacob, his wife Sarah, their 2 children, a boy and a girl whose names he could not recall with certainty, though he thought the boy had been named Isaac and the girl had been called Margaret. He spoke about what had happened to the family, and about what the community had done when the truth began to emerge. What Turner described was not a crime of sudden violence. It was a crime of persistent, calculated cruelty that had been practiced within the walls of that remote homestead for something close to a decade before anyone beyond the family knew what was happening. And the reason it had continued for a decade was the passage. The passage had allowed the Demings to keep certain things hidden from the view of anyone who might come calling. What those things were, Turner did not explain in detail. He spoke around them, in the careful language of a man who had never been able to fully speak them straight. But the shape of what he described was clear enough. There had been other people. People who were not supposed to be there. People who had come to the Deming property through a route that did not pass through any official record, and who had stayed there for periods that were longer than a visit should be. Some of those people had left. Some of them, Turner believed, had not. The passage between the house and the barn, in this understanding, had been the mechanism by which Jacob Deming had been able to maintain the appearance of ordinary farm life while something else entirely was happening beneath the ground. Visitors in the house would see the ordinary surface of the building. They would not see what was below the surface. They would not see the people who were being held in the cellar of the barn, because the cellar of the barn was not accessed through the barn itself. It was accessed through the passage. Miller's photographs of the property from a distance, taken with his large format plate camera, show a house that appears, on the surface, to be what it was supposed to be. A two-story frame structure, a barn, a windmill. The photographs are clear and precise, the technical skill of a man who had been making photographs for a long time. They show the property in the autumn light of the high plains, the grass yellowing, the trees on the property beginning to lose their leaves. They show a place that looks, in the way that photographs make things look, like it belongs in the album of a family's memory. But there is something in the photographs that Miller did not intend, that he could not have intended because he did not know it was there. A detail that someone looking at the prints in 1978, 65 years after they were made, would notice and wonder at. Near the edge of the frame, where the property meets the open prairie, there is a shape in the grass that does not appear to belong to the landscape. Not a rock, not a tree, not a bush. Something else. Something that resembles, in the blur of the long exposure and the motion of the wind across the tall grass, a small mound of earth that has not been there long enough to be covered by the grass. A shape that could be a grave. Miller had not noticed it when he made the exposure. He had not noticed it when he printed the plate. He was looking at the house, at the barn, at the arrangement of the structures in relation to the land. He was not looking for a shape in the grass. He was a photographer doing a job, and the job was to document the buildings, not the ground between them. He would not have seen the shape even if he had looked directly at it, because he was not looking for it. But the photographs saw it. The photographs saw it and held it and kept it, and when the daughter opened the portfolio in 1978 and looked at that image with the knowledge her father's letter had provided, she saw it too. A small, subtle shape in the grass, near the edge of the frame. A shape that had been there in 1913 and had not been there before that. Whatever had been buried there had not been buried long enough for the grass to reclaim it completely. And whatever had been buried there was not something that anyone had wanted photographed. Miller's letter did not provide any definitive conclusion. He had not investigated the property. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, ever returned to the town or attempted to learn more about the Deming family's history. He had done exactly what Turner had asked him to do. He had photographed the property from a distance, and then he had put the camera away and packed his wagon and left. And for the remainder of his life, he had carried the weight of what he had seen and heard without ever attempting to test it against documentary evidence or to verify it against any other source. When his daughter opened the portfolio in 1978, she was confronted with something she did not know how to handle. She was a woman of 61 years, a retired schoolteacher living in Minnesota. She had not expected to find a story like the one in her father's letter. She had expected, if she had expected anything, to find photographs of the plains, the people, the railroad, the ordinary record of a town's existence. She had not expected to find a secret. What she did with the portfolio is a matter that the records do not entirely clarify. She contacted a historian at a university in North Dakota. She contacted a journalist in Minneapolis. She contacted the Historical Society of the town in question, which by then had dwindled to fewer than 100 residents and was itself in the process of closing its small museum and sending its records to a larger institution in the state capital. She sent copies of the photographs and of her father's letter. And she asked what should be done. The historian was interested but cautious. The journalist was interested but uncertain of the legal and ethical implications. The Historical Society was interested in the photographs themselves but extremely reticent about the story that accompanied them. A representative of the Historical Society who corresponded with the daughter in the early 1980s told her, in a letter that she preserved, that the Society had no information about the Deming family or the property and no record of any event that matched her father's description. He suggested that her father might have been mistaken, or that the person who told him the story might have exaggerated. What the Historical Society representative did not say, but what the daughter learned through a separate inquiry, was that the records of the town from the period in question had not been as complete as the representative had implied. Sometime in the late 1940s, a fire had destroyed a portion of the town's records. The fire was small and had been quickly contained. It affected a room in the courthouse annex that contained records from the 1890s and early 1900s. The fire was attributed to faulty electrical wiring. The records were not replaced. The gaps that remained in the official record were, by the time of the daughter's inquiry in the 1980s, simply part of what was missing. What is known about the property after the Demings left is limited but suggestive. Jacob Deming sold the property in 1904 and moved west, eventually settling in Oregon, where he died in 1912 at the age of 62. His wife Sarah had died in 1902. The two children had left the region in the early 1900s, the boy going to Montana, the girl to California. Neither of them had spoken publicly about their childhood in the Dakota Territory. The people who bought the property after the Demings left were a family named Osterberg, immigrants from Sweden, practical people who had come to the Dakota Territory to farm and who were not, by any available account, interested in the previous family's history. They farmed the land, repaired the house and the barn, lived quietly, and raised children. The passage, if they found it, they never mentioned to anyone who recorded the fact. The property was sold again in 1936 to a family named Dahlgren, who also farmed it quietly and lived and died without drawing attention to the property's past. It passed to a development corporation in 1952 and was subdivided into small parcels that were never built on. It sits there still, in the Dakota Badlands, a piece of ground that nobody has ever had a reason to examine carefully. There were stories, of course. There are always stories. A woman named Gertrude Berg, who had grown up in the town and was in her 80s when Miller visited, had told him a story about a girl who had lived in the Deming house when she was young. The girl, Gertrude said, had been her friend, and they had played together in the yard of the house during the summer of 1894. The girl had been quiet and had seemed afraid of her own shadow. She had talked about the barn in ways that Gertrude had not fully understood at the time. She had said that there were people in the barn, but that they were not supposed to be there, and that she was not supposed to talk about them. Gertrude had not understood what the girl was saying. She was a child. She had not asked the questions that she would have asked as an adult. She had accepted the girl's words as the ordinary expression of a child's imagination. And then the girl had stopped coming to play. Gertrude had asked her mother about it. She had been told that the Deming family had decided to keep their daughter at home for a while. She had been told not to go to the property and not to ask questions about the girl. Gertrude had obeyed. Decades later, she told Miller what she had seen and heard. She told him about the girl and the barn and the people who were not supposed to be there. She told him that she had never forgotten the girl's face, a thin, frightened face with dark eyes and a stillness that had seemed unnatural in a child of that age. Miller wrote it down in a notebook he kept for such things. He did not mention the notebook in his letter to his daughter. But the daughter found it in the bottom of the portfolio, tucked behind the photographs, and its contents confirmed everything the letter described. What happened to the Deming children after their parents died, and what happened to the people who had passed through that property in the years before the Demings left, is not a story that can be fully reconstructed from the evidence that survives. The photographs are silent. The letter is a single account from a man who was telling a story he had been told by a man who was himself telling a story he had not witnessed directly. And yet there are clues. The marks on the passage walls, the marks that were scratched into the stone at regular intervals, were found by the people who eventually located the passage. They were counted. There were more than 100 of them. They were organized in groups, the way marks are made when someone is counting days or people or something else. The people who counted them said that the marks had been made over a period of years. They said that the marks at the beginning of the sequence were older than the marks at the end. They said that some of the marks had been made by a different hand, a smaller hand, they thought, perhaps a child's. They said that the sequence ended abruptly, and that the final marks had been made in a hurry. The passage itself was sealed in 1962 by the owner of the property at that time, who told a local official that he had found it while digging a new fence post, and that he had decided to fill it in rather than examine it. He was a practical man, and he did not see any reason to leave an abandoned passage open on his property. He filled it with earth and packed it down and planted grass over the top. The entrance in the root cellar was sealed with concrete. The entrance in the barn cellar was sealed with concrete. The passage disappeared again. A group of amateur historians from a nearby town attempted to locate the passage in 1998, using the documents that the historian had assembled in the early 1980s. They found the property. They found the remains of the house and the barn. They could not find the entrance to the passage. The earth had settled. The grass had grown. The concrete that had been poured in 1962 had been buried under debris and neglect. A historian named Charlotte Voss, who led the group, wrote a report of the attempt that concluded with a sentence that has been quoted in several subsequent accounts: "I have a suspicion that the passage is still there. I do not suspect that anyone will ever find it." Charlotte Voss's suspicion is consistent with what is known about the property's current condition. The land is still there. The section lines are still recorded in the county plat books. But the property itself has been parceled and sold and parceled again. The house is gone. The barn is gone. The windmill is gone. The garden has been reclaimed by the prairie, and the prairie has been reclaimed by the grass and the sage and the scrub. The Deming name has faded from the local memory. When historians ask people in the region about Jacob Deming or Sarah Deming or the Deming children, they receive blank looks. The names that persist are the names of the people who came after, the Osterbergs and the Dahlgrens and the various families who bought and sold the land. The Demings are not a story that anyone tells. It is more accurate to say that the Demings are not a story. But the shape of what happened on that property is still visible. Not in the land has been worked and reworked for more than a century. Not in the records have been lost and burned and misplaced. But in the memory of the people who heard the stories and passed them on, and in the photographs that Everett Miller took in 1913 and sealed in a portfolio that was not opened for 65 years. A memory and a photograph are all that remain of the property and the people. And in the letter that Miller left for his daughter, there is a final detail that adds something to what is known. Turner, when he finished his account of the Deming family's history, told Miller something that Miller did not fully understand until he left the room and walked out into the street to pack his wagon. "I told you this story," Turner said, "because I believe you will keep it safe." He said he had been carrying it for a long time. He said he believed the story needed to be held by someone who would not lose it. The photographer carried it for the rest of his life. He carried it without knowing whether he should have carried it, without knowing whether it was true or whether it was merely the elaboration of a frightened community trying to understand something it could not otherwise explain. The Truth, 27:00, 29:00. The final lines of Miller's letter are what make this story different from the ordinary account of a forgotten crime in a forgotten place. "What I do not know," Miller wrote to his daughter, "and what I suspect no one will ever know with certainty, is whether Turner's story was true in the way that stories are true when they are told by men who have lived with them for a long time, or true in the way that stories are true when they are told by men who have come to believe them because they cannot bear to believe anything else. The distinction, I have come to understand, is not as clear as I once believed it to be." He wrote that the town's silence was not the silence of people who did not know. It was the silence of people who had chosen, after long reflection, not to act on what they had allowed themselves to see and to remember. In this regard, Turner's account of the Deming property fitted a pattern that Miller recognized from his years of travel. Communities that had lived through things they could not fully explain, and that had decided, collectively, that certain facts were not facts, not because they were not known, but because knowing them was worse than not knowing them. The town had chosen to let the Demings' secret remain sealed. And when the Demings left, the town had chosen to let the story of the passage remain sealed as well. He ended the letter with a paragraph that his daughter read and reread and eventually used as the epigraph for an article she wrote about her father's work many years after his death. "I have been a photographer long enough to know that a photograph is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what the camera saw. And the camera does not see everything. It does not see the secrets. It does not see the things that were deliberately hidden. It sees only the surface, and the surface is almost always a lie." The daughter lived until 2006. She died in Minnesota at the age of 91. Her obituary mentioned her father's work as a photographer and noted that she had been involved in preserving his extensive collection of images, which had been donated to a historical archive in North Dakota. The obituary did not mention the Deming property or the letter. It did not mention the passage or the photographs that her father had sealed away. It did not mention the 100 marks on the stone walls or the shape in the grass near the edge of the frame. The portfolio and the letter, after her death, passed to her own daughter, a woman named Marilyn who lived in Illinois and who had no interest in the history of the Dakota Territory. Marilyn placed the portfolio in a storage unit in Chicago, where it sat for several years. In 2014, the unit was auctioned when the storage fees went unpaid. The contents were purchased by a dealer in estate items, who found the portfolio and the letter and the photographs and recognized them as having historical value. He attempted to contact the family. He was unable to locate anyone. He consigned the items to a rare document dealer in New York. In 2017, a researcher at the New York Public Library, working on a project about early photography in the American West, came across the photographs in the dealer's catalog and recognized the name Everett H. Miller. He purchased the portfolio for a modest sum and began to research its contents. He found the letter. He read it. He contacted the Historical Society in the Dakota town, which by then had ceased to exist as an entity. He contacted the University of North Dakota. He contacted the North Dakota State Historical Society. He found the article that the daughter had written about her father's work. What he did not find was any confirmation of the story in the letter. The records of the town from the 1890s and early 1900s were no longer accessible. The property was no longer identifiable by its original name. The Deming family's records, such as they existed, had been destroyed in the fire of the 1940s. The passage had been sealed and buried and forgotten. There was no physical evidence to support the story of the passage and the people who had been hidden in it. The researcher, his name is not recorded in any of the subsequent accounts, published a brief article about his discovery in a small journal of regional history in 2018. The article focused on Miller's photography and on the quality of his images, which he described as fine examples of the documentary tradition in early 20th century photography. He did not mention the letter or the story of the passage. He described the photographs as a record of the property, of the buildings, of the town. He did not describe the marks or the shape in the grass. The portfolio is now in a collection at a university in the Midwest. It is available to researchers by appointment. The photographs are accessible. The letter is accessible. The interpretation of what the letter describes, what the photographs might record, is left to the reader. The land where the Deming property once stood is still there, in the Dakota Badlands. The grass has grown. The earth has settled. The concrete that was poured in 1962 has been covered by debris and by the slow work of erosion. The passage has been sealed for more than half a century. The marks on the stone walls have not been seen since. And somewhere, in the grass near the edge of the property, the shape that Everett Miller's camera recorded in 1913 is still there, a small, subtle depression in the earth that has not yet been fully reclaimed by the prairie. What do you think? Do you believe the story Turner told Miller was true? Do you think the passage was used for what he described? Or is there another explanation? Leave your comment below, ****. This story, like all the stories we tell here, is based on real events, real documents, and a real photographer who carried a secret to his grave. If you want to see more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves history that isn't in the history books, ***. We'll see you in the next one.